This is all going to be about the underground. This paper is done in conjunction with Adam Bevan at the Institute of Railway Research at the University of Huddersfield, and it's about predictive wheel rail management. Needs to be pointing over there, I think. So a very, very quick background. Our iconic slogan, "Mind the gap." When Victorians built railways, they didn't really worry about going in straight lines, so we have an enormous amount of curves. Basically, if you were to look at the older it is, the more curvy it is. So the original 150-year-old bit from Paddington to Farringdon is pretty tight, and then as they get newer, you see the Victoria line built in the late 60s, early 70s. There's no curves below 400 meters in radius on that, which makes it a lot easier. So a few years ago, in 2013, we started looking at rolling contact fatigue. If you ask people who go back before that, the underground didn't have rolling contact fatigue. I don't know how much you want to believe that, but some people would say there was. Certainly, we were a railway dominated by wear. We had, much older trains with stiff bogie frames, so there was more wear, but I think there was RCF. So we introduced the MRX, Rail Surface Crack Measuring Kit, which is here on the left, which is a magnetic flux, similar to eddy current, does it in a slightly different way to start actually trying to measure some depths of RCF. We also introduced on the right there is our B-scan, so it's the same as A-scan in terms of ultrasonics, but you get an auditable trace. We can actually look at the results offline rather than relying someone in the middle of the night staring at a screen and making decisions on defects. So after we introduced the Rail Surface Crack Measuring Kit, what we were really hoping was if we ran it round enough, we'd get some nice growth rates, and we'd be able to therefore say what our kind of grinding regime should be, how much material we'd expect to remove, how many passes we'd need. We didn't really see results like that. We had a lot of re-railing when we first ran it around, and then when we started running it around subsequently, we didn't quite see the growth. And I would say a lot of for example, on the Victoria line, we did a lot of re-railing on the north end of the line, but to be fair, that was original 1967 rail that had been in for 40 years and had properly done its time. So we started looking at some models, trying to see whether we could work it. This is the whole life rail model, which was developed in the UK following Hatfield, really to try and give some better predictions of RCF. So you've got two curves there. One is for 260, one is the other, which was proposed for HP335, which we've also started installing. And this is quite a simple model. What it says is basically on the x-axis, you've got T gamma, which is a function of traction and creepage, and then you've got a damage factor. So what it says is that below a certain threshold, you shouldn't be able to generate RCF cracks. And then you start generating cracks up to a peak. And then really wear starts to come in as well and starts to take you on the downslope. And what it says is beyond a certain point, you should just generate wear. But for the 335, because it's harder, that whole thing gets pushed to the right, which is what that is showing. So this is some generic simulations in Vampire. This is just using RS stock. So we have two types of tunnels, the very old ones with the big trains, the newer ones with the little trains. This is about an 8.5-ton axle load compared to the tube train, which will be more like 5. So in theory, this should be the worst. So what this shows is some generic simulations. That's radius just on the x-axis, so coming down from 800 down to 200 with the corresponding damage factor or the wear factor that comes in. And what we're showing is, so the pink line, which is the correct colors for the Hammersmith and City line, and the green line, which is the correct colors for the District line, showing that really we've got a peak around, although interestingly for the 260, what that sort of dip is really showing is that we're going over the top of the triangle effectively at those 2 points. But showing that 335 should reduce that. So the solid lines are for the leading axle. So the leading axle will, once we're getting down to these kind of radiuses in hard flange contact, as you'd expect. But what's been most interesting for us is actually the dashed lines of the trailing axle. And what that's showing is that really we're seeing more peak damage from the trailing axle, which doesn't shift as much laterally to get around curves. And that's around the 200 meter radius mark where that peak is coming in. So these are some plots that were developed as part of an RSSB project by the Institute of Railway Research called circle plots. So this is another way of looking at what you're looking at is effectively, if you imagine, each of these dots is a different contact. So this is just for new wheels and new rails. We could plot a load more wheel profiles. And what it's saying is moving across is showing where your contact is relative to the gauge corner. That's why it goes from 0 to 70. And then what the angle is for is to show the angle of the traction of that contact. And then how you use the color scale is effectively it starts at a light yellow where you're starting to generate up to reds in the peaks, and then going back to green once you're over the top into that wear. And on the left, you've got the 260 version, and on the right, the 335 version. So I know this is very difficult to see, but hopefully what it's showing is that we're getting a change in contact angle at those different, as the radius gets tighter, and also we're moving through the wear into the peak RCF and then down through the wear. So that's just for the high rail, so the top ones, sorry, are for the leading axle, back ones for the trailing axle. So you can see here, we're getting light RCF until we hit around the 200 meter radius mark where we're really starting to show. From the model, we should be setting peak RCF. So how does that look with what we found on the ground? Well, on the left there is a 400 meter radius curve, and on the right is a 200 meter radius curve. This is photos taken under MPI. So what you can see is we've got that band of cracks in the gauge corner. That angle is bang on what you'd see in the model. And then in the trailing axle, you've got this blue box, which is where it's saying we're over into wear. But now you can see the trailing axle generating all our cracks in the middle of the railhead. And this little orange one, which you may not be able to see, is actually probably some cracks almost longitudinal to the rail, where as the rail wears, obviously we move into slightly different zones. So for the 335 versus 260, so this is a couple of curves that we're monitoring as part of it, and what you can see really is hopefully these are the tonnages, 260 on the bottom, 335 on the top, so you can see up at 18 million gross tons, just starting to see some cracks, but in the 260 you've got cracks from 13 million gross tons onwards. So for the low rail, so we generate plenty of low rail RCF as well. That's a function of having very tight curves, but you can actually see again 260 R peak should be around 600, and the 335 down at 300, which is one of the interesting things that the model predicts is that actually, for example, in a 300 meter radius curve, if we put 335 in, we would move from being in wear to generating RCF. I like wear, it's nice and predictable, and I can plan for re-railing. RCF, not as predictable. And again, for the trailing axle, you can see we're getting around that sort of 200 meter radius, which is generating our peak. And again, so this circle plot showing the same thing really, just for the low rail, that again, getting is that 200. Feel free to look at them in another time. Yeah, this just illustrates basically what this is showing on the circle plot. So we're still showing about the correct angle of creepage that we're expecting, but in that 300 as we move through, we're moving back across the peak of the triangle. I'd love to say I've got some 335 in a 300 meter radius curve where I can show whether that's true or not, but I don't. So we've put in about 1,500 meters of HP 335, some of it under projects as part of renewals, some of it put in by the maintainer. Unfortunately, we've already had our first broken rail in it. So this was between Liverpool Street and Bethnal Green on the central line. And what you can see is that if you look at a lot of broken rails, normally you see a much bigger ductile zone where the crack has developed, and then it's actually shattered, but you can see a very small ductile zone. So when we took this rail out, it had about 0.5 mil deep RCF cracks in it, but it had gone very fast fracture within 13 million gross tons of insulation. But if you look on the right, this was taken as it was pulled out of the ground. You can see it's also mounted on what's called Pandrel Vanguard resilient housing, because this is a noise complaint site where we have a lot of corrugation. So that rail, this is actually a different rail, but what we were interested in was to see whether the HP was doing anything that we were seeing was particularly different. So this is a cut through the center of the rail, running longitudinally, and you can see this is where we get this effect of spooling, breaking out on the top of the rail, but you can see what happens is the cracks come down practically at 90 degrees. Often they join up and results in ultrasonically untestable rail. In the 335, it appears it doesn't spool out as much, but tends to go straight down fast fracture. And that's why typical gauge corner RCF crack, 30 to 40 degrees parallel, and these ones in the center of the railhead seem to be developing straight down the rail, which in 260 leads to untestable, but doesn't lead to broken rails. So as I said, that site was on Pandrel Vanguard, so one of the things we decided next was we better look at the vertical stiffness. So these are some rail deflection measurements as measured on site. So on the y-axis you've got displacement. The time is, because we're in a fixed point, that's the train going over. So the orange lines is the vanguard. So you can see you've got about 3 mil of rail deflection. And then the blue line is on a timber on ballast, and the concrete is concrete sleepers on ballast. It's through a site that was renewed, but it has some check rail in it. At the time, we didn't have a check rail base plate for concrete, so it goes on timber, and you can see there we're getting around 1 mil, 1.5 mil. We're actually getting slightly more in the concrete, and we think that's due to it being a check base plate and the weight of the base plate being much bigger because it's holding 2 rails. But you can see in the vanguard, as it is, the whole point of it is very vertically, very soft, so that the noise doesn't get transferred into properties, but it's giving us big rail deflections. So that's a bit of a gallop through some RCF. Are we getting reasonable predictions from the model? We are. Do we get a rate? No, that's another piece of work, but please feel free to read the paper that we're working on in a different way. But in the last 5 years, we've measured, I've only put one wheel profile up there. I think we've measured 16,000 in the last 5 years, so we've got a pretty good idea of where our wheel profiles are, which enables us to make our model a lot more accurate. Moving towards a preventative rail grinding strategy, unfortunately things like access, trying to grind in deep tubes that don't have ventilation, all those kind of things that prevent us doing that. And the next things really for us are looking at adhesion. I'm trying to move as much adhesion onto the train, take it off the track, because with things like night tube, you don't get any access. Major projects, you don't get any access. And soon, if you follow the press, we were about to award a tender for a new vehicle, but that's currently in the courts. So we will eventually get a new vehicle that we'll be able to look at. 20 seconds over, that's not bad. Thank you.